Well, we are finishing our podcast week for this 19th week of Ordinary Time. We're going to look at a really important prophecy that's coming to us from Ezekiel, and it's also one of those ideas that we recognize that comes as we look back and we see yet another prophecy has come true. It's also here we are on the memorial of Saint Maximillian Mary Kolbe, who was priest and martyr. Now, I'm sure many of you know the story of Saint Maximillian Kolbe. I should mention something here. I interviewed the associate producer of a movie, The Two Crowns, which I'd recommend to you. It was great. I had to watch the movie so I could do the interview, and I did the interview, and it was a great movie. The whole story was very good. And I was fascinated by this reality. Well, this movie answered a question for me that I had always had about Saint Maximilian Kolbe, and it was this. He was a faithful priest, a very good, holy priest. He served the Lord. He was very powerful in his service, the Lord, in his doing service for the Lord. How is it that he ended up in the concentration camps in Nazi Germany? Why would the Lord allow such a good, holy priest to end up there? Now, this is one of the things that is not often proclaimed about the Holocaust, and many people will blame the Jews for this. I don't. I blame the Catholics for this. And that is that, in case you didn't know this, there were 14 million people who were executed in the Nazi concentration camps. 6 million were Jews. So if you ask people if you ask like students today, how many people died in the Nazi concentration camps, they'll tell you 6 million Jews. It wasn't. It was 14 million people. And actually the Catholics were the largest group outside of the Jews. Now, a lot of people look upon the Jews negatively because of this, and they say, no, there were there were so many Catholics, and there were this and that and the other thing. I don't, because the Jews will tell you there were 6 million Jews that died in the concentration camps. Why don't we know about the rest? Because those groups, including the Catholics, are silent. That's why. I disagree with the Jews on just focusing on the Jews, but that's the only thing I disagree with. As far as I'm concerned, they always bring out the concentration camp because they don't want to see it happen again, and obviously they were the main targets. But yes, there were the largest non-Jewish group of victims in the concentration camps were Catholics. I learned that from John Loftus, who I think has since passed away, but he was at one time an employee of the State Department, United States State Department. And he said that on a radio show we had when I was back working in public radio. So that's an important distinction. But people will say, well, the Jews only tell you the 6 million Jews. It's not because of the Jews only telling you 6 million Jews. It's because the Catholics not telling you about the Catholics. This is a problem I have. I really do. And so I don't blame the Jews. Some people do. I don't. I blame the Catholics for not talking about the Catholics. And don't forget all the other groups that were there. And that's so important. The people who were mentally ill or had some kind of a physical deformity, they were in the concentration camps. The homosexuals were in the concentration camps. People who became enemies of the state for their advocacy against Nazism, they were in the concentration camps. So there were 14 million people there. But the question I always had was why, if Saint Maximilian Kolbe was such a holy, good person, why was he in the concentration camps in Auschwitz of all places? And there's another story I should bring up about that. And then after seeing the movie, The Two Crowns, I realized I had it backwards. he, as a good holy priest, was in the concentration camps to be the presence of God in this absolutely dark place. Kind of like if you know the song The Impossible Dream from the Man of La Mancha. He was marched into hell for a heavenly cause. So that's a powerful, powerful reality that I came to understand. It wasn't that he God didn't care how holy he was. He let him suffer anyway. It was the other way around. God sent him there to be his presence in the concentration camp. And if you know how he died, first of all, you know the story. He volunteered his life. This man escaped, and then the Nazis came in and said, well, because this man escaped, we're going to make 10 people die for the fact that this man escaped. So they started choosing people, and they chose this one man, Jewish man, and St. Maximillian Kolbe stepped out and said, no, take me instead of him, or take me. And so they did. Now, you realize the Nazis could have said, well, we'll take both of you, but they didn't. And they took him, and he was the presence of God in this cell they put them all in and made them suffer starvation. And he was the last one to die. I think actually they shot him after he realized that he was the only one who's still alive. But he led them all in singing and praising praising God and prayer and everything else, which must have driven the Nazis crazy, which is probably another reason why they shot him at the end. But in any case, that's this powerful story. Now, I said I was going to mention something else. I'm not going to get into the January 6th issue. I think there were things wrong on all sides, and it definitely looked, there was a lot of manipulation, a lot of problems, and there's a lot of issues, and that's something that Congress has to settle once and for all as far as investigating this and what happened and the whole story and everything else. But one of the people who was arrested wore a sweatshirt that said Camp Auschwitz. Of course, it was this anti-Jewish thing. Well, St. Maximilian Kolbe died in Auschwitz. So the fact that he wore it, regardless of where St. Maximilian Kolbe died, was intensely offensive. Of course, it's protected speech in the United States. But even more so for us Catholics, I think it's unacceptable. So that was an issue too. So we see all that, and we recognize this powerful moment of the life of the church in the case of St. Maximilian Kolbe. And again, there are many people will look down upon the whole Holocaust. They'll call it the Holocaust industry and all the other stuff. I leave that alone. But the fact that people will walk around and say, yes, the Nazis executed 6 million Jews and not know about any of the other people, I blame on the other people, including the Catholics and the Catholic leaders. But that's where I stand. So keep that in mind. I don't get into this anti-Semitism for any stretch of the imagination because, there are several leaders in the church that are very much against the Jews. And they'll call out the Jews all the time and everything else. Well, I'm a pastoral minister, and I have to look at how all this stuff affects people on a personal level. So if you're calling out the Jews because of your disagreement with the way the Holocaust was handled, the way, post World War II, the way things are handled, the way you see Jews in different parts of the world, or whatever the case may be, and you push that stuff, then you might get, Billy Jones turning against Mary Goldstein just because you're pushing this anti-Jewish stuff and not understanding that this affects people on a personal level. So I'm very much against that stuff because the Lord calls us to love one another, regardless of who they are. We're called to love everyone. And if you don't like Jews, that's your problem, but you're not doing what the Lord calls us to do. That's an important distinction, and that's something very important to be taught in the Catholic Church. There were people who I consider absolutely brilliant in the church. I'm not going to mention any names. Absolutely brilliant in the church. Have some powerful philosophical and theological aspects to teach, but they hate Jews. And I think that is a major issue, because ultimately when you stand before the Lord, he will say, did you love your neighbor as yourself? And if your response is, well, yeah, except for the Jews, that's a problem. It has to be everyone. And that's an important distinction. In any case, and this is real. What was it? Mondami has this judicial committee, and he has no Jewish lawyers on it. What kind of a person is not going to have a Jewish lawyer on a judicial committee? I'm sorry. What kind of a person is going to do that? I'm sorry. That's just absolutely ridiculous, but we won't go very far there. In the meantime, you're listening to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. We're going to talk about the reading in the second half. We usually do it in the first half, but we were talking about the memorial for today. We're going to focus on the reading. In the meantime, you're listening to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. We're here every single Monday through Friday. Our program drops at midnight. Subscribe, like, pass the word. We'll be right back right after this. Have you ever wanted to read the Bible but didn't know which readings to check out? Well, how about looking at the Church's daily readings? You can find them at the website of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Just go to bible.usccb.org and click on the date that pops up on that page. There are other options on that page as well. That is bible.usccb.org, and click on the date and you will see the daily readings for your own prayer and study of the Bible. This is a prayerful tip from St. Anthony Parish in Allston, Massachusetts. If you're looking for a way to contact the show, there are two ways to do it. You can do it by phone and contact our listener line. Telephone number is 617-297-7452. That's 617-297-7452. You can also email the show at producer@catholicaudiomedia.com. That's producer@catholicaudiomedia.com. Those are two ways to contact the show, and feel free to do that. So again, that's 617-297-7452. You can leave a message on our listener line or send us an email at producer@catholicaudiomedia.com. We're back, and we're looking at Ezekiel. Now, you actually have two readings actually you have, what was it, 4 readings as an option, but we're going to focus on Ezekiel. And you have 2 Ezekiel readings as an option, Ezekiel 16, 1 through 15, which we are not going to look at, and Ezekiel 16, 59 through 63, which we are going to look at. Because there's something there that's important, which, of course, I always say that. Well, this is a powerful reading today, which occasionally I don't because it's just an interim. But, yeah, because it's amazing what is in these readings. And this is why we focus on the first reading. So, and remember, by the way, prior to Vatican II, many people didn't know these readings because they were in Latin. And they didn't know them, or they weren't proclaimed in this way, which is why after Vatican II, as people started hearing the readings or started reading their Bible and the readings at Mass, they were, why didn't we ever hear this before? Because they were in Latin and it was a 1-year cycle. Well, what we're looking at here is a promise that came to exist at the death and resurrection and ascension of Jesus. So we're going to look at this, 59 through 63, and as always, we go to our Catholic public domain version. We're looking at this powerful understanding of the covenant is what we're going to see it. So let's go to Ezekiel 16:59. So here we go. We're at 16, and let's scroll up to 59 and read what we have to see. For thus says the Lord God, I will act towards you just as you have despised the oath, so that you would make void the covenant. And I will remember my covenant with you in the days of your youth, and I will raise up for you an everlasting covenant. Sound familiar? Okay. That's the Last Supper. Okay. The old covenant it was broken by the people, and we can say the Jews, because that's the only people with whom God made the covenant, and then restored it through the Jews. So this is an important distinction. Again, back to what I was saying before the Mass. Okay. So, for thus says the Lord God, I will act toward you just as you have despised the oath, so that you would make void the covenant. And I will remember my covenant with you in the days of your youth, and I will raise up for you an everlasting covenant. And you shall remember your ways and be confounded when you will have received your sisters, your elder with your younger, and I will give them to you as daughters, but not by your covenant. This is talking about the unification of the Jews and Gentiles. Because remember, this is one of the powerful prophecies we see many times in the Old Testament, that the Gentiles will be brought into the fold. You can imagine, we don't know for sure, but you can imagine that this reading was mentioned by Jesus to the two disciples on the way to Emmaus, talking about, yes, all this was part of the new covenant. This is what had to be done. The covenant was sealed by the blood of Christ. We get all this, and we see that. This is so powerful. And I will raise up my covenant with you, and you shall know that I am the Lord. So this is what's happening. So may you remember and be confounded, and it will no longer be for you to open your mouth because of your shame, when I will have pacified toward you over all that you have done, says the Lord. So here we have the Lord is predicting this new covenant that will bring in the fold the Gentiles. This is spoken about all the time in the Old Testament. And it's part of the process. God first picks the Jews to be the agents of his vessel, of ultimately his role of salvation. And the whole focus of this role of salvation is that all will be saved. When Jesus dies on the cross, he doesn't just die for the Jews, he dies for all, which is why I get really irritated. And I know there are people, going back to what I was saying in the first part of the Mass, I get really irritated by the people who say the Jews killed Christ. No, the Jews and the Romans killed Christ. The Jews represented themselves, and the Romans represented everybody else, because, I mean, they were the Romans. They practically were everybody else. And this is an important perspective. And the Jews were the leader of the Jews. I know there are these people, and again, back to what I was saying before, these very prominent, very intensely intelligent people have tremendously powerful things to say, and then they bring in their anti-Semitism that really darkens what their message is. But this is important. I don't get into this. I really get pretty angry at this whole Christ killer stuff and all this other stuff. Oh, the Jews. No, it was the Jews and the Romans, because it is through this covenant sealed by Christ's blood that the Jews and the non-Jews are united in the covenant with the Lord, and that this becomes the new role of salvation. Jesus died on the cross for everybody. It's an important distinction to know. It's really important, because we have to know, and remember, we're called to think as God thinks, and God remembers that all people, God remembers that everyone, that Jesus died for all. That means he died for all the people who we like and we don't like. He died for, the robber who stole from somebody. He died for him. He died for all. This is it. He died for all. He died for the good. He died for the bad. And we've got to understand that and preach that and live that. So this is all part of it, because as we see in Ezekiel, God will bring all people back into his fold. So it's a pretty powerful message for us to see, us to recognize, and us to celebrate. And when we do all that, and we recognize and we celebrate and we understand what the Lord has done, and we recognize that power of the Lord, then we can see here in Ezekiel this powerful message. And remember the context. The context is that the people abandoned the covenant. They've turned and they're worshiping Baal. They're seeking their own desires. They're turning away from the wisdom of the Lord. And as much as this angers God, he doesn't give up on them. And that's an important distinction. He doesn't give up. He continues his mission. A couple times he wants to, but he doesn't, because he wants to recognize that he died for all. This also brings us into another thing, because you got these people who, I swear, I know this actually doesn't happen, but there are these Catholic ministries that act like that behind the scenes, that they dance through their cubicles at the thought of people going to hell. There's one particular who was really focusing on hell at this point, and I swear I actually don't, but it really seems like that behind the scenes they're celebrating the fact that people are going to hell. God wants all people saved, and our role is to follow the commandments of loving God and loving neighbor so that all people can be saved. We're seeing a lot of difficulty happening in our country, and I'll tell you right now, it's because many times the Catholics did not accept their role and their action. They didn't do what they were called to do. And because of it, similar to the whole story of the Holocaust, the reason why people don't know of all the Catholics who died during the Holocaust is not because of the Jews, it's because of the Catholics and the silence of the Catholics. There was whole sections just for Catholic priests who the Nazis despised, and many of the priests spoke out against the Nazis from the altar. You don't hear that either, but yes, they did, and they were remanded to the concentration camps, and they were executed there. But no one talks about that, and it's not because of the Jews, it's because the Catholics remain silent, and that's not right, because I've seen that dynamic happen before, trust me. We'll be back right after this. You're listening to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. Did you know that Catholic TV offers free apps for both Android and iOS users? Visit the website catholictv.com or your app store to download this faith resource to your device. If you're looking for a way to contact the show, there are two ways to do it. You can do it by phone and contact our listener line. Telephone number is 617-297-7452. That's 617-297-7452. You can also email the show at producer@catholicAudiomedia.com. That's producer@catholicAudiomedia.com. Those are two ways to contact the show, and feel free to do that. So again, that's 617-297-7452. You can leave a message on our listener line or send us an email at producer@catholicAudiomedia.com. We're back, and we're going to start again next week for the 20th week of Ordinary Time, Year A, and we're going to be focused still on Ezekiel, and so we're going to look at some of that all next week. And tomorrow is not a holy day of obligation, but obviously it is still the Assumption of Mary. That's in the United States, by the way. It's a holy day of obligation elsewhere. But the United States is not a holy day of obligation. It's still the Assumption of Mary. And therefore, that is the day that will be celebrated if you attend Mass tomorrow. We'll be back on Monday. Have a blessed day.
Yeah, you know the real is back. Father Carr Chaplain from the city of champions, dropping daily reflections coming straight from the field. The raw truth revealed for the strong-willed. It's the Greatest Act of Defiance podcast with your host Father Carr, a message built to last. The Greatest Act of Defiance podcast. That's right, the Greatest Act of Defiance. Word up. Word up. Word up.
Catholic teaching in this podcast is reflected and presented as accurately as possible. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the Archdiocese of Boston or any other institution.